Welcome to the channel, Foundations of Real Estate Financial Modeling. Today we're going to go over one quick concept in real estate investments, which is return on equity. We'll talk about what it is, a formula, and then we'll go through a quick sample problem. We'll do it in Excel as well as in a whiteboard so that you guys can see how, if you want to calculate it by hand, how it's done. So what is the return on equity? Return on equity is simply the measure of how the investment performed in relation to the equity that was personally invested. In real estate, you have equity and debt. So if you want to see just how your equity performed, which is really all you care about, that this is how you would do it. We'll go through it. It obviously measures profitability of your investment, and the higher the return on equity, the better the investment performed. So very simply, this is the formula that we're going to use today to calculate the return on equity. So here is the example, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 properties. We got the returns. We got how much the cost of debt was, which is essentially the interest you're paying on your debt. You have the amount of debt, the amount of equity, and we want to know what's the return on the equity that we invested. So we can do it in Excel first. Let's zoom in a little bit. Okay. So for our formula, we have the return on the property plus the debt to equity ratio times the return on the property minus the cost of debt. It's 9.5% on your equity. Then you can just drag it and we get all the different returns on equity. Now if we want to do it by hand, we're going to have to pull up our whiteboard. So let's do this. Let's split screen it. Let's have the values available. Okay, now we're ready. So for the first property, we have a return property. Let's just write the equation real quick on front so that we can follow along as we're going through it. Property minus cost of debt. Okay, so the first property, you want to find out its return on equity, which we already did, but we're doing it by hand. We'll say it has an 8% return on property plus $50,000 worth of debt, $100,000 of equity times 8% minus the cost of debt, which is 5%. And that yields a return on equity of 9.5%. So that's the first property. Now let's take a look at the rest of them. The second property has a return on its property of 10%, has a debt to equity ratio of $75,000 to $125,000. The return on the property was 10%, and its cost of debt was 6%. So the return on equity on the second property is 12.40%. Okay. Second property completed. Let's go to the third one. We have return on property of 12% plus a debt to equity ratio of $100,000 to $150,000. Return on the property was 12% and the cost of debt was 4%. For a return of equity of 17.33%. Fourth property, we have a return on property of 9% plus $25,000 debt over $75,000 of equity. And then our cost of debt on this one was 7%. The return on equity of 9.67%. All right, last and final property. Let's scroll down a little bit. We have a return on equity which is equal to 11% plus $200,000 of debt over $300,000 of equity. A return of 11% minus 3% cost of debt. Our return on equity is equal to 16.33%. Now, an interesting thing to point out is that the properties that have the lowest cost of debt are the ones that are yielding the highest returns on equity. And that is something that is pretty typical in the real estate industry, and the reason why debt is used on investments. So debt is really used to increase the return on your equity. So when you have low cost of debt, you typically tend to borrow more debt if you're allowed to, or if the banker gives it to you, and if your risk profile accepts it, and a bunch of other metrics. But obviously, cheap debt is a good thing for a real estate deal. As you can see, when you have cost of debt of 3%, you end up with a return on equity of 16.33%, right? As you can see, return on equity of cost of debt of 4% gives you a return of equity of 17.33%. So as the cost of debt goes up, that return tends to go down. But yeah, that's really all. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you guys next time.